The neck belts, introduced last month in an attempt to reduce head injuries.
Life is filled with little bumps.
Cars have greatly evolved in technology and mechanics. They're no longer the death traps they once were in the early days. You may not remember, but there was actually a time when certain car features seemed unnecessary, unsafe, and even bizarre. Stick with us as we have a closer look at dangerous car features that are gone for good. And be sure to hit that subscribe button, and let's get started.
Buckle up for safety, buckle up for safety.
Starting off with one of the most outrageous car features ever made, the neck seat belt. In the 1960s, there was almost always a divide between innovation and practicality. This was evident in the manufacturing of neck seat belts by car companies in a bid to create a safety feature that restrained the head while driving, and to avoid whiplash when accidents occur. This restraint focused on a rather sensitive part of the body, being the neck, completely ignoring the shoulders, waist, arms, and legs, which would have been a lot more practical. The seatbelt, which wrapped around the neck, was akin to a noose, and the latch was tucked away behind the passenger. This design, however, did not make it to distribution, and the idea would be scrapped before the opportunity to cause any casualties occurred. Various manufacturers like General Motors and Ford conducted testing and found the neck seatbelt had design issues, and while it did secure the neck firmly to avoid whiplash, the head and other parts of the body would lean into the force, causing severe trauma, which even in mild accidents could be a huge problem for the passenger. In the 1970s, questions about safety and efficacy of the neck seat belt led to a halt in production and trials by manufacturers, leaving all questions unanswered. The chest and lap belts seen in today's vehicles are not only comfortable, but provide the highest level of protection that any other seatbelt position could.
To get used to, two 5-inch rings turn simultaneously and are manipulated.
The wrist twist steering system was a new driving mechanism that surfaced in the 1960s, aimed at replacing the conventional steering wheel with an outlandish innovation that was set to completely revolutionize driving. Ford Mercury would be the first to release this awe-inspiring steering transformation in their convertibles. The wrist twist steering system consisted of two rotating control handles, one on both sides, connected by a paddled link. It allowed the driver to rotate their wrist to control the direction of the car, and interestingly, the steering design was meant to reduce the strain on arms and shoulders, allowing drivers to rest their elbows for comfort. This made long driving experiences less tiring. Steering with these dials seemed completely different and appeared to be more of an experimental project rather than an actual progression in automobile design. The steering, like conventional, had allowed you to steer in any direction and return to arm level when seated. It also allowed a clear, unobstructed view of the dashboard. However, there were challenges that ruined things for the wrist twist steering system. Adjusting to the new design was overwhelming and created a mental burden for all those who were used to the free hands of conventional steering. It greatly lacked in responsiveness for safe driving, and the panels were often quite confusing. Safety became a major issue because of the absence of a padded steering rim, which left drivers completely vulnerable in the event of a crash. The 1970s saw the demise of the wrist twist steering as manufacturers searched for the next breakthrough in the automotive industry. Next up, the unforgettable awkwardness of the water balloon bumper. During the mid-20th century, a particular safety feature for vehicles was making a huge splash on the roads, and you might take it literally because every single bumper collision would be a wet one. Vehicle manufacturers, while on a quest to enhance safety features, decided to fortify car bumpers with water to reduce the force on impact in the case of a collision. These water-padded bumpers were supposed to cushion the effect, and in doing so, would save lives and property. These watery innovations went into distribution in the 1950s, and the public didn't seem to have a problem at first because it was a rather curious design and a few skeptics had expressed their concerns. Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford would all launch their own versions of the water balloon bumper car, but there were so many problems. Besides its lackluster appearance, the plastic or rubber material used to store the water was often vulnerable to leakage. The water balloon bumpers were completely ineffective in a high-speed crash. With the advancement of research on crash safety, manufacturers began to realize that the water bumper design was closer to bad aesthetics than it was to safety measures, and people began to shift from vehicles with weird water mechanisms in their front and rear to well-engineered cars with more advanced safety features. Water balloon bumpers slowly faded in the 70s as other experimental designs took over the market. From sharp, deadly projectiles to steering wheels that have a mind of their own, keep watching to see more dangerous car features that are gone for good. Metal dashboard knobs are next on the list. These knobs became popular at the same time that dashboards were made. At this time, the novel dashboards were made of metal and other components that were integrated into the cold, hard steel. Most people were excited to have the opportunity and privilege to ride in the biggest technology of their time, so safety wasn't exactly on the list yet. The dashboards were mostly made out of metal panels. The knobs protruded, giving passengers a turn or push option. Knobs were usually made of metal as well, and that provided matching aesthetics that were a standard feature for controls, such as adjustment knobs for the radio. The cold, hard metal knob seemed a durable component until it became a safety concern. Companies like Chevy and Ford adopted the knobs, and it was found that they became cold, hard weapons during a collision. Crash testing would reveal the various possibilities. Even if drivers survived the impact of the metal dashboard, the metal knobs became dangerous projectiles that could seal the fate of any passenger. The lack of safety padding and the hardness of the metal became a major concern, so in the 1960s the metallic knobs were substituted with insulators like plastic and rubber that was much lighter and more delicate. As the metal knobs disappeared, so did the dashboards, which were replaced with a more padded material for safety, aesthetics, and comfort. If you've ever seen a rare 1939 Dodge or 38 Chevy, you're probably wondering what the extra upholstered exterior seat behind the vehicle was supposed to be. That interesting feature was called the rumble seat. It was inspired by coaches and carriages, a mixture of the old and new at that time, which provided extra external space for passengers. Some called it the mother-in-law seat, while others called it the dicky. This seat was usually integrated into the rear and often foldable, and also served as extra space for luggage and seemed pretty convenient. The problem with the feature is that it was also exposed to the external elements. There was no protection from the passenger compartment. Some versions, like the Ford model, came with 2 doors, but the rumble concept never received attention from car manufacturers, so it naturally phased out. Let's have a look at this next feature: bench seats without headrests. In the early days of vehicle manufacturing, headrests were not a thing. The focus was usually on the quality of the seat. However, in the late 1960s, headrests gained popularity when they were introduced as a solution to whiplash. Car buyers initially were more intrigued by the horsepower and other aesthetics than they were the headrests, and they were quite fine having a seat without them, as long as the car could run. In 1960, car brands like Volvo began enforcing the headrest as one of their standard features, and as buyers started to develop a preference for headrests, other car brands then joined the bandwagon. Headrests not only provided comfort, but also safety from a sudden whiplash, protecting the head and neck muscles in the event of a collision. As safety standards evolved throughout the era, it became mandatory for every vehicle to have a headrest as a standard safety feature. There's nothing as risky as not having a backup safety plan when driving your car. While other safety features may be present, cars that used the single-circuit braking system were always at a constant risk whenever they were on the road. Before the late 60s, most vehicles used single-circuit braking, a type of braking system where all 4 brakes, both front and rear, were controlled by a single hydraulic circuit. This meant that brake fluid was distributed to all 4 brakes by a single main line. At first, drivers didn't give a second thought until accidents began to occur, causing failures in the single hydraulic circuit. There was no replacement to quickly take over from the single point of failure when there was a malfunction due to a leak or failure of the master cylinder. In most cases, the entire brake system would fail, and this would lead to catastrophic accidents because drivers were unable to stop the moving vehicle. This was a particularly dangerous thing if the driver was at a high speed. Since the dual circuit system was introduced in 1967, manufacturing companies were able to create a redundant system that would take over if the first one became faulty. The dual circuit braking system helped to mitigate accident risks, and the single circuit disappeared over time.
Columns in, mounted, and our steering shaft is figured out. Pretty straight shot there.
Another feature that posed a significant danger to drivers was non-collapsible steering columns. In the early 1960s, vehicle manufacturers experimented with the aesthetics and sturdiness of steering wheels, and this led to the design of rigid structures hoisting up the wheel. They were known as non-collapsible steering structures. It was a solid metal rod connecting the steering to the ground wheels. These structures had been quite popular, without complaint, until accidents began to unveil the safety challenges. Now, because the component of the structure was rigid, it posed significant risks for the driver, who could easily be impaled during a collision. Many drivers had to drive knowing that if there were ever a collision, they may be completely at the mercy of this inflexible structure. To make things even worse, there was no buffer to mitigate the impact of the rod if there was a collision, and in 1967, General Motors made the first move to change the status quo by launching the first collapsible steering wheel column. The steering could collapse and contract upon collision, prioritizing the driver's safety, and it wouldn't be long before other car manufacturers took the cue, making safer steering columns, while non-collapsible steering was thrown into the past where it belongs.
It's the nicest looking, the nicest fitting. The only thing I say is give it a scuff and a coat of clear coat to make it look nice all the time.
Some features were so terrible they gave drivers a bad experience on the road each and every time, and one such feature was the solid rear axle. This interesting feature came at a time when automobile design was in its infancy, and the solid rear axle is a type of rear suspension system whereby each wheel on both sides was mounted to a single rigid axle housing. That same axle housing contained the differential axle shafts, and both wheels moved together at the same time and pace, and that meant that whatever was happening to one wheel would also be happening to the other. The solid rear axle does have its advantages. It's strong, durable, and can handle heavy loads even while traversing through rough terrain. They were perfect for trucks and off-road vehicles along with SUVs. To make things even better, they were also cheap and great for heavy hauling applications. However, on a regular road, the solid axle made rides bumpy and uncomfortable, and also made handling difficult. The axles transmitted more road shocks and even vibrations to the cabin, which made drivers and passengers sick. It made high-speed cornering dangerous with the probability of a car flipping, and in 1922, the independent front suspension was manufactured and hit the market in 1932. Drivers instantly noticed the massive difference between the solid rear axle and independent suspension, and unlike the solid, the independent enhanced comfort, allowing each wheel to operate independently while isolating the imperfections of the road. It provided a better way of traction and stability on the roads, and today, most cars you see have independent suspension systems on four wheels. This has always been on building cars that save lives. This next feature did the complete opposite. It counterintuitively ensured that fatalities increased each and every collision, introducing the gas tank's position behind the rear axle. These were some of the most disturbing times in automobile history. The Ford brand introduced a new model called the Pinto in the 1970s, a luxurious car that was also compact. However, this design had one major flaw that was discovered only through numerous fatalities. The fuel tank was located at the back, just behind the rear axle. This sensitive positioning made the fuel tank susceptible to rupture and massive explosion upon rear-end collision. Drivers first accepted the sleek new model without a clue as to what was coming, but everything changed when the rear-end collisions caused the tanks to explode, causing fire outbreaks from the spilled fuel. These accidents were massive depending on how many vehicles were present at the scene, and various crash tests would reveal that it didn't take much to rupture the tank, and the Ford Pinto was a safety hazard. Ford was fully aware of the problems that came with the Pinto. However, it prioritized profits made from the massive car sales over the safety of its consumers. Instead of opting to recall to fix the vehicle, the brand chose to compensate victims, and in time, the cases began to rise, hitting a total of 27 fatalities with many severe burns. Ford was hit with a barrage of lawsuits as well as negative media coverage that defaced the name of the brand, and punitive damages were awarded against them. After numerous financial settlements, the brand decided to stop the production of the Pinto by the late 1970s. In the advent of automobiles, manual choke controls were used specifically in internal combustion engines, typically in vehicles with smaller engines. The manual choke was used to regulate the air-fuel mixture while starting up the engine. It restricted air supply in the carburetor, which enabled the fuel mixture to kickstart, especially under quite cold temperatures. The manual choke is a lever located inside the vehicle, and drivers only have to manually adjust it by pulling or pushing to warm it up. This obviously wasn't always convenient because drivers had to learn how to adjust the choke or they may end up stranded. The manual choke was so complex, there were cases of user error, inconsistent performance, and safety risks. One of the major problems was engine damage, which resulted when the choke was engaged for too long. The fuel would flood the combustion chamber and cause damages as well as carbon buildups, which affected the performance of the engine in the long term. In the late 20th century, automatic chokes were manufactured, which reduced the need for drivers to constantly intervene in starting the engine. The transition to electronic fuel injection mechanisms in the 80s and 90s rendered the choke a mere relic of the past. In the early 20th century, hood ornaments were a huge sensation, and many car manufacturers used them to showcase their brand identity. These ornaments were decorative artistic sculptures that sat on the hood of vehicles and caught the attention of onlookers who would stop to share and marvel at the class of the car. The Rolls-Royce brand was one of the first to launch the Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament in the 1910s, and other brands followed in the trend with Jaguar, Bentley, and more. These ornaments were symbols of opulence. However, the sharp hood ornaments often posed a safety problem. There were reported cases of them flying off their hinges and posing a safety threat to pedestrians. The beauties of these features were overrun by their potential danger, and ornaments with sharp edges or made out of metal could impale and hit pedestrians, causing mild to fatal injuries. Modern safety standards discourage the use of hood ornaments in order to decrease the chances of injury through projectiles. By the 1970s, rules for pedestrian safety were prioritized, leading to the strict rules for manufacturing companies. Hood ornaments slowly disappeared, and car brands that still use them make them collapsible or retractable to hide them while on the road.
And then when the ignition is off, when you open the door, the tilt column actually swings up towards the center, making...
Imagine a steering wheel that slowly swings away when the driver's door opens, providing the driver ample space to slide into the vehicle without constriction. This fascinating innovation was called the swing-away steering wheel. Many people were fascinated by the feature of vehicles such as the 1961 Ford Thunderbird. However, it wouldn't be long until safety concerns were recorded from users who had experienced mechanical issues. While the design seemed to be convenient, it often got stuck, unable to return to its original state, which is unsafe for use. This often left drivers stranded on the spot until the steering could be fixed. The possibility of the steering accidentally moving to the side while the car was in motion was another risk that could put the lives of people in the vehicle in danger. The swing-away steering wheel slowly lost its hysteria during the 1970s as manufacturers pivoted towards better safety mechanisms for the future of automobiles. What are your thoughts on these dangerous car features? Let me know in the comments below. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe and turn on your notifications to stay updated with all the latest content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.